So thank you so much for joining me, Bill. Tell us about this new report by Washington Post saying the Taliban are sending its fighters to the eastern Afghanistan to fight against the ISIS. How serious is the ISIS-K threat to Afghanistan, and is the challenge for the Taliban rulers?
I think the Islamic State is a challenge for the Taliban, but I don't believe that it's an insurmountable challenge. I was actually expecting this to happen at some point in time, because the Taliban focused its efforts for the past 20 years at defeating the coalition and the Afghan government. The Islamic State was out there and has challenged the Taliban's rule or the Taliban's dominance in the jihad before the Taliban took control of Afghanistan. And the Taliban did fight them in Nangarhar and other places, but they didn't eliminate them. And I think the reason for that was the Taliban had bigger fish to fry. That was the coalition and the Afghan government. And I always maintained that once the Taliban, if the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, when that moment came, it would turn its guns on the Islamic State. And so seeing the Taliban reinforcing, Nangarhar has been the real hot spot. There's been other places like in Kunar and some limited areas in the north where the Islamic State occasionally has a presence. But Nangarhar, the Taliban has maintained a significant presence there throughout. The Taliban actually defeated them in 2019 with the help of the U.S. and the Afghan military. The U.S. basically served as the air arm for the Taliban. But the Islamic State is persistent, and I think that is one of its only advantages, or should I say it's an advantage it shares with the Taliban, is that it has staying power despite all of the odds stacked against it. So again, I expected this. The Taliban have to eliminate this threat. Now, whether they will be successful in doing so, that I think is what we're going to find out. But here's one thing that we witnessed over immediately after the Taliban took control of Afghanistan and the U.S. withdrew on August 31st. The Taliban went into Panjshir, and people did not think that this would be a successful operation. People believed that most analysts that I knew believed the Panjshiris would hold out, would be able to defend the province. It would be difficult, but the Taliban defeated the Panjshiris in about, I think it was 7 or 8 days. They were committed to that fight. They sent thousands of fighters through the passes. From what I hear, they took significant casualties doing this. So I don't believe the Taliban, is going to waver in its fight against the Islamic State. The real question is, will the Islamic State adapt to this? How does it respond to things like not having state-sponsored terrorism, not having safe haven in places like Pakistan? All the advantages that the Taliban had in its fight against the coalition and Afghan forces, the Islamic State have none of those advantages.
So recently, UN also warned over ISIS spreading all over Afghanistan, but Taliban constantly refusing any support from the U.S. side, while U.S. is stressing on over-the-horizon mission there. How is it possible that they can fight back the ISK?
Well, Islamic State is only estimated to have several thousand fighters. I've seen numbers anywhere from like 2,000 to 4,000. These numbers are difficult to assess. Oh, I gotta turn this phone off. Can we start that over? I apologize.
Yeah, sure. You can just start the answer.
Yeah. So the Islamic State is. I gotta unplug this stuff. Sorry about this.
No problem. Take your time. Then we can just start whenever you start.
Yeah, if you don't mind re-asking me the question, because
no
I got distracted here. I have a phone that I use rarely, and it just starts ringing, of course, in the phone calls. Go ahead.
So the UN recently warned that ISIS is spreading all over Afghanistan. At the same time, UN, not US. I start the question again. So UN recently warned that ISIS-K is spreading all over Afghanistan. It used to be in bigger cities, not in all over the 34 provinces. At the same time, US is stressing on its over-the-horizon mission, and Taliban constantly refusing any support when it comes to defense front from the US. How they can fight back the ISK?
So the United Nations, I'd like to see the information behind this. Does this mean that there's 10 fighters in throughout the provinces? Is it hundreds? It's thousands? The reality is the estimates that I've seen of the Islamic State are several thousand fighters in the country, period. That could be anywhere, and reasonable estimates around 2 to 4,000. We have really no way of knowing how accurate this is, but it seems about right. And the Islamic State is primarily focused in Nangarhar and Kunar and a couple of other provinces. If it's spread throughout Afghanistan, it's done so on a cellular level. I don't believe it's done so in a manner that can threaten the Taliban's primacy in holding territory. And I think that's really what is being missed here. The real threat to me in Afghanistan isn't the Islamic State, it's the Taliban. The Taliban controls territory, it controls a nation, it controls the weapons left behind from the army of the Afghan government, the Afghan military. It remains allied with Al Qaeda, the Turkestan Islamic Party, the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. The host of Pakistani and Central Asian jihadist groups are all allied with the Taliban. And the Taliban can bring these forces to bear against the Islamic State, just as they did against the United States and then against the Afghan government at the very end. So I think the Taliban has the means to take on the Islamic State. It has the will to do so, just as it did in Panjshir. The problem with Afghanistan that I'm seeing throughout the press and throughout Western governments is the Islamic State is being viewed as the real threat here, and the Taliban itself is being whitewashed. People forget that they use suicide bombers, that they host Al Qaeda, that they host all these regional and terror groups and local terror groups that operate throughout South and Central Asia, and including Al Qaeda, right, which is a global terrorist organization. The Islamic State is an easy target, and this is what people are focusing on, even within the U.S. government. Now, as far as the Taliban rejecting U.S. over-the-horizon strikes, the Taliban fought a war for 20 years to get the United States to leave. The last thing it wants is the United States involved in the Taliban's business in any way, shape, or form. So it will continue to reject this, and I think the Taliban believes it can defeat the Islamic State on its own, and this is what we're going to find out, I think, over the next year or two.
So Treasury Department, with coordination with the Office of Foreign Currency and the State Department, designated 3 Afghan individuals as global terrorists, which were facilitating finance for ISK in Afghanistan. What does it mean to the Taliban?
Oh, this just means, it means very little to the Taliban. These designations, in my estimation, the real value of the designations is to identify leadership and then to prevent anyone in the West or throughout the world from funneling money or other forms of aid to these individuals. But very rarely do these designations actually lead to anything significant. So all this, in my opinion, what this does is just helps identify the Islamic State's leadership. The one individual who's listed as the Islamic State's leader, he's been identified by the United Nations earlier this year. So yeah, I don't, the designations process, it's to me is more of an academic process and a process that, hopes to prevent financial and other aid flowing to these terrorist groups. But locally, they tend to mean nothing. These individuals are operating in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and they're beyond the reach of the of Western governments. And the Taliban is also hunting them as well. So yeah, I don't see this as having any real impact in the Taliban's fight against the Islamic State, or even in the West's fight against the Islamic State. The West isn't launching counterterrorism raids, and I don't expect this to happen given the difficulties with basing and overflight rights.
Sounds great. So the last question, sir, with increasing attacks by ISK, do you think the Taliban will respond to the regional diplomacy calling on them to form an inclusive government and perhaps to fight the ISK threat?
I don't believe the Taliban will ever form an inclusive government. It waged its jihad for 20 years. It won. There's no real opposition within the country except for the Islamic State. So, I mean, you could argue if it wanted to be bring the Islamic State into the country, into the government, that might tamp down the violence, but it's not experiencing violence from anyone else. It's not under pressure from any other groups. Now, you can argue that, this causes long-term problems for the Taliban, but I don't think the Taliban sees it that way. It won. It had an outright victory, and why would it didn't compromise for 20 years. It won, so why would it do it now? Now, look, I think that Western governments are eager, not Western, just the international community is eager to fund the Taliban government, to provide aid and cash to the Taliban. And they'll probably get it. What did the Taliban learn during its negotiations with the United States? That it didn't have to cede a single thing and it still got what it wanted. That's what I think the Taliban is going to practice here. It will receive humanitarian aid. It will get a form of financial aid and probably some of the funds that are frozen, unfrozen, so it could pay its individuals. The Taliban has learned through years of negotiation with the U.S. and the West that not compromising is beneficial to its ends.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. I want